Buongiorno.
Hello and welcome to all those who are watching us.
Questo bellissimo spazio.
We are at the Muse Museum, a splendid place where we will have this meeting. Laurence Boone, Chief Economist of OECD, thank you so much for participating. And Salvatore Rossi, an economist, a distinguished economist. He was General Director of the Bank of Italy, and now he is the President of Team Telecom Italia. So what are we talking about? We will speak about economic policies which have to be implemented to counter and to overcome the pandemic. Combining that with the fight against climate changes, or at least the consequences of climate changes. So, if it is true that we will have huge job losses, well, it will be really necessary to do something and boost the economy again. Well, in these days, we learned a lot of things during this 15th edition of the Festival of Economics. And there is a common thread which has guided us. That is the notion of economic externalities. And here I would like to mention the director of the festival and the Nobel Prize, Esther Duflo, that is that our actions today can have either a positive or a negative impact on other people's lives and also on future generations. So we cannot pass on the cost of our crisis to our children and future generations. So we need to look at this aspect as well. And all the governments under the leadership of the European Commission and its president are trying to do something about that. Now, I would like to raise a question for both of our speakers, and Laurence Boone will be the first to answer. So, as we said, the pandemic has had a huge impact on global economies. So what is the situation like today? Someone is already speaking about a second peak, a second wave. So, and then what are the outlooks for the next few months? Thank you.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be with you, and I deeply regret that the pandemic doesn't allow me to travel to Trento. As you were mentioning, I think the main feature of the outlook is really the extreme uncertainty that we are facing. It's very difficult to make any projections when we don't really know how the virus is going to evolve. So the first word that really characterizes the outlook is uncertainty. Now we've faced the first phase with a lockdown and reopening. So we had a very sharp contraction of activity and then a sharp rebound for most, but not all activity. And as long as we don't have a vaccine or a treatment, we will have to live with the virus. And that means that we are going to live with an economy that only operates at, say, roughly 90-95% of its capacity. So what does that mean? It means two things. First, that some sectors are impaired for quite a long time, and second, what we have seen in the first phase is huge policy support, and that worked well to preserve the income of people and to preserve firms. So now when we look ahead and we know that we have this 95% economy, which is about the only thing we know, we also know that policy matters. It will matter for helping people who will lose their job because their sector is not working properly any longer, or because people are afraid to go out. And it will help as well to for firms and entrepreneurs to actually move on from sectors which are not really working towards those that will be working much better in this phase. And it's obviously health or pharmaceutical, but it's also environment, and we can talk about this later. But I think uncertainty and policy matters are the two main words of this outlook.
Thank you. Grazie. Professor Rossi,
Professor Rossi, well, the issue of employment is really topical. This is an unprecedented crisis, also in terms of the impact on workers, on employees, and it's young generations and women, independent workers, professionals who are suffering most of this for this crisis. And they become unguaranteed people, so to say, not included people. And this is perhaps the most critical point. Yes. Well, if we speak about economic policies, we should immediately differentiate between emergency and relaunch. The emergency has been tragic, as we all know, and as also Laurence said. And it's like the opening of a big fall made by lockdowns, confinements, but also closing down of offices, factories, places. GDP declined hugely, and also employment declined. In particular, the least protected categories, the most precarious workers, have suffered most. And economic policies had to overcome that emergency, thinking that that emergency would last just a few months. And we will see now if that is true, that the emergency is over. So emergency instruments were used, and that means money, subsidies, benefits, in order to help the economy to overcome the abyss and go to the other side of the abyss, trying to survive with the least possible damage. And then, after the emergency, and at least in Europe, during summer, the crisis has slowed down. And I'm not thinking about the second wave of the virus. Well, now, after the summer, we need to develop, relaunch policies. And the Italian case becomes really peculiar because the Italian economy had been suffering a stagnation for almost 25 years. So for 25 years, Italy has been sort of going very slow and has had a sort of a stagnant economy, even slowed down economy, and that for a series of reasons that I'm not going to mention. Well, and this pandemic could give us the coup de grace, or could be an opportunity to rethink, to revise our policies and do something really tangible, really concrete. And I'm not talking about political sites. It's just that we haven't been able in the past few years in Italy to find a way out of this crisis. So the pandemic perhaps could be the right occasion, the right opportunity for us. And Europe is going to allocate a lot of money, a lot of funds, many more than the usual funds allocated normally, in order to facilitate a mid to long-term recovery. And Italy has to use that opportunity. Now, Mrs. Boone, I'll come back to you. What do you expect from Italy under this perspective? And later on, we will have the Italian Premier here at the festival. So what are the expectations in Europe about Italy?
So I think I completely agree with Salvatore that the main challenge for Italy is growth. It has been growth for quite a while now, for about 2 decades. And that has to do with a number of things. I don't think we should look at the growth rate for this year. It's going to be about -8% for the euro area as a whole and -10% for Italy. We think with a rebound of 5% both for the euro area and for Italy next year. But what really matters, I think, is the policies that are put in place looking ahead. And in a few days or in a couple of weeks, Italy will present the budget, has to prepare for using the European Recovery Fund. And I think that will be very crucial to actually give a good start to the rebound that we have seen in the third quarter for the Italian economy. Now, there are a series of things. One is to focus on people and human capital and make sure that people are properly trained, they have the skills and to actually thrive in these new sectors. And then there are 2 points on which Italy, like a number of European countries, can improve. The first one is provide the right training to the people who are in part-time job or have low skills and make sure that they can upgrade, and also have the proper employment agencies to actually help them go into the labor market, into a job. And something that's specific to Italy is, I think, the departure of many very highly skilled people that we find often in international organizations like mine, but who can actually make a difference when they come back to Italy and start doing business. So one is human skills, really. The other thing, which is super important in my view, is the investment that will be made with the European money. So today, Italy, like many European countries, has a huge opportunity of actually investing in the future. And that's not only education, it's not only health, which is obviously very important, as this crisis has shown, but it's also everything that's related to energy and infrastructure. And as you know, the European Union has very ambitious climate change targets, but it's very difficult to put in place. And with two things. First, with the fact that rates are very low and that investment which is needed to help the economy revive can be done by borrowing at a low price. And also because there is the European Recovery Fund, Italy, like many other countries, has a unique opportunity of actually investing in what will shape a cleaner future. Let me just remind you of what happened in 1935, because we always talk about a New Deal. So in 1935, when the US actually implemented its New Deal, you may believe it or not, but most of the investment that was made at the time was already in clean energy and transport and manufacturing. It's what allowed hydroelectricity in the Tennessee Valley. It's actually what allowed hydroelectricity in the French Alps at about the same period. And it also what allowed rural areas to be equipped with electrical light rather than petroleum light. But if we fast forward to our current period, what we can do is actually equip Italy and the rest of Europe much better in terms of digital technology, not only because we need it for teleworking, we need it to help people with lower skills to actually have better jobs, but also because we badly need it to equip Europe with clean energy. The digital grid is key for energy to be more renewable. And I'm sure Salvatore has a lot to say about this. But it's the equivalent of what was done about 100 years ago. And I think we really should seize this opportunity today.
Thank you. Professor Rossi.
Professor Rossi, the technological dimension, how can it help? How can the technology help? I believe that Professor Boone really reiterated that we now have a unique opportunity to seize. So Italy has to seize the opportunity in order to fill the gap vis-à-vis other industrialized countries. I was impressed by the parallel that Laurence made between what happened in the United States almost 100 years ago with the New Deal of Roosevelt and what might happen in Europe and specifically in Italy now. So this is also a tragedy, as was the case with the Great Depression in the United States. In our case, we also have and have had a high death toll, so it is even worse from that in that respect. Laurence correctly said that the New Deal was also focused on the use of technologies that, consciously or not, made the environment greener, less polluting. So if we now take a leap forward and comment on the situation today, we can say that the so-called technological devices are certainly a driving engine, and that is for sure. We all see that. We do not even need to explain that point. But at the same time, they also make it possible, and again I'm talking about digital technologies, they make it possible to do things to save and to pollute less, and I'm talking about CO2, with fewer emissions. I would like to make an example which is related to my recent experience. The fiber optic cables, which are really talked about a lot today because they are used for communication purposes, when compared to copper wires, are made of silicon, and they transmit communication using light. So due to the very technology of these optic fiber cables, they reduce polluting emissions. This is just one example out of many that we could mention, and yet it is very important. So we have here technologies that at the same time make economic growth advance massively, and we Italians need that very much, and they can also contribute to addressing the huge problem that the world has now, which is environmental degradation and CO2 emissions, which really are a danger for us. We run the risk of not surviving as humanity. Team is working at the single grid for Italy, which would be a great infrastructure revolution for Italy. Are we capable of making this in reasonable time so that we can keep pace with change and possibly also anticipate it? Because the point would be here to connect everybody, all families, all places and locations in Italy. Well, the answer is yes, we are technically, technologically in a position that we can do that. And we will do that. Also because we all know that the pandemic revealed something which is very clear, which is we need to be connected. We can all remember that during the lockdown months, the moment when we could connect online with others, be it friends or colleagues, or was really the most important moment of the day, and that went for meeting people, so seeing faces or seeing documents. That was our window onto the rest of the world. Being connected is fundamental. It is essential as the air we breathe. That was true already before COVID, but it became apparent during the COVID emergency. So the idea of having a telecommunication network which is made of fiber and which connects all households and which is one and which does not entail that we waste materials or energy is very important. Of course, fiber optic improves the environment, but you see, you have to dig holes to lay down cables, and that is an old activity, and you have environmental issues there. So if we can avoid doing excavations twice, that is very important. You are very right in saying so, because we could organize things so that construction works are not duplicated, so to say. So we could combine things for the electricity grid and for other services, isn't it? So absolutely, we have to have that as a goal. Or otherwise, it would be too expensive, possibly, or what? The costs are not the issue. Rather the opposite. We would save if we managed to do that. The economy at large would save. Of course, we have then different entities, be them private or public, which and who will have to find a way to strike a balance. But in terms of the macroeconomy as a whole, we certainly save. Professor Boone, I guess that you agree about the importance and the central role of new technologies, also based on what you said earlier on, but possibly that they are not enough on their own. What should governments do on their part, for instance, in terms of fiscal policies?
So, as you guessed, yes, I totally agree on the role of digital technology. There are a couple of things I think we governments can do, and where we can learn also from the past. In terms of what governments can do, you know, you have three types of action for policy. One is effectively what type of action is it? Are we talking about retrofitting houses? Can we talk about electrical cars? We can talk about many things, but that needs to be organized. And we also need both investment and incentives to do that. In terms of investment, Salvatore mentioned quite a few. So let me just insist on the fact that it's super important to actually not repeat to be very careful with the type of investment that we do, especially when it comes to addressing climate change. Let me give you a few examples. When you invest into electric cars, it's a 15 years long investment. When we invest into solar panels or we invest into windmills, that the digital grid we were talking about will connect to consumption, then we're talking about 20 years life investment. If it's about nuclear energy, it's 50 years. If it's about transport, these infrastructure, they usually are here for like 100 years. So investment planning, careful investment planning with a long-term view is the first thing that governments must do. The other thing is, and that's a lesson from the previous crisis, we can, provide some incentives to do things, and that has to do with carbon pricing, for example, and we can talk about that later. There are a number of issues with carbon prices, but when we fix, I think it's still an important tool for governments, because in this period of very high uncertainty, having a path ahead of us for what the price of carbon will be will actually help the private sector to invest into the right technology. So it's super important that we start thinking about it. And that brings me to my third point, is we also know that carbon pricing actually hurts the most vulnerable people who need their car, and they usually buy cheaper cars to go to work, or for whom, for example, the price of electricity or heating at home is a large amount of spending considered in light of their revenues. We also know that carbon taxes obviously affect small firms, which are energy incentive, and which often have been hurt with the crisis. So I think one of the big lessons of the past decade is carbon prices are necessary to give some certainty, and that's important in this crisis. But the revenues of carbon taxes cannot fix the budget problem of a government. They have to be used to compensate the people who are most affected, because it's there to provide some incentive to change behavior. It's not there to raise revenues, and the revenues from the carbon taxes should compensate the most vulnerable with the price of their energy, with the price of their transport. So by contrasting, for example, constructing public transport or subsidizing their energy consumption when it comes to firms, as well, as long as the energy consumption is green. So it's very important to have the certainty with the price, the compensation, so that it's publicly acceptable and also does no harm, and then a medium-term vision for investment, because investment have long life shelf, and the European fund need to be used very wisely to make sure that this budget is a one-off, but if it's used wisely to really change and enhance trend growth, then it may not be a one-off. We may have a second one or a permanent one.
Quindi bisogna avere
Thank you very much. So we need to have a vision before acting. We have to be clear in our mind about what we want to obtain, and we need to be very cautious and attentive and careful. We need to consider a plurality of elements which include pricing emissions, compensating and indemnifying those who pay the highest price in terms of taxes, including carbon tax, and we have also to work so that we induce people to change their behaviors. So within this framework, which brings together all the things we said over the past days, what about the role of the private investor? What is the role of the private investor? And I'm talking about collaboration between public and private entities. You chair a very important business listed on the stock exchange. So what about cooperation between public and private sectors?
Well, I've been a private investor, let's say, for 1 year. So, but in the previous 40 years, I was a civil servant. in government-linked companies. So I've got a very good vision of the needs and objectives of both private and government or state companies. And now, in order to face this terrible event of the pandemic, well, we need to have synergy between economic policies, public policies, and private business. Of course, private business works in the interest of shareholders or of their stakeholders anyway. But the objective should be a single objective, because also private companies, well, if the whole economy collapses and the whole society collapses, well, they will not survive. So there is a common objective to pursue. And also private business should be aware of the public shared objective and should cooperate. Now, more tangibly, there is no doubt that there is a big role to play by private companies. And we should not forget that economies are made by businesses, by companies. It is companies which produce the income which is then used to pay everybody's wages. Well, it's true that the state-owned companies give guidelines, or the government gives guidelines, but it's true that those who do things, who make things, are private businesses, at least in our market economy. Well, do you think that there is this awareness among private businesses so that they need to go beyond the idea of profit-making? So do you think that there is this awareness of a higher scope? Well, in my opinion, yes. And if it's not present, it should be promoted, stimulated. And it should be done by convincing businesses about what I said earlier, because it is also their interest. It is in their interest that the whole economy can recover and then become richer. So I think that there is this awareness, and if it's not present, it should be stimulated. Well, Professor Boone, in European models, what is the situation of private businesses? So do you see changes among private businesses, a cultural change? So do you have the impression... Sorry. So do you have the impression that they go beyond just the profit-making vision? You have the floor.
Thank you. I'm sorry for having interrupted you. Yeah, I think that's right. I actually agree with Salvatore that there is a dimension, and this has been going on, I think, at least since the financial crisis, that firms have to take into account all of their stakeholders when they're trying to maximize their value. And when we say that, who are the stakeholders? So the stakeholders are obviously the owners, the equity holder. But it's also the employee, and it's also the community in which firms are locating. And we can see, I think it's particularly striking in the US, but it's also very important here where you see how community may react when a firm actually has some investment plan there or is closing a plant there. So that's one thing. I think taking into account all your stakeholder is the responsibility of the firm. Now, one thing as well is, when we were talking about and discussing about long-term investment earlier on, I think there's an increasing demand for investment that is long-lasting and that takes into account what will happen over the future. For example, I'm sure you've heard about stranded assets. Today, if an investor is investing into an energy company, It will look at how these companies actually planning for the change in energy, how it is getting renewed, and where it is going with this plan. We can see that very well just looking at the stocks of those companies and the value that they have. When they have plans for moving into more renewable energy, then this has some value for the investors. And then I think, there's all this work going on in Europe to have a taxonomy of what's a green investment or what's a sustainable investment, and to actually offer investors with the opportunity to know when they invest into a firm that this firm has some ethic when it comes to who it employs across the world. It has some ethic in that it is measuring, for example, its carbon footprint. And that's something that will be increasingly valued by people who invest in those companies, and the people who invest actually they're you and me with their savings, or most people across the world. So I think that is increasingly being taken into account. You can see it also, and that will be my last point, with the rise of demand for impact investment or green infrastructure. And for this, we need something that Salvatore was mentioning earlier on, which is a partnership between the private and the public sector. So in the past, this has not always been done. We have often seen that the public sector is taking the risk and the private sector is taking the reward, if I want to simplify a little. But, for example, the UK is doing that quite well. And when there's a good combination of risk-reward to invest in long-term infrastructure, think about battery, for example. We don't have battery infrastructure in Europe. We need them if we want to move to electric battery, hydrogen battery cars. Then this will be super important. And perhaps last thing, and I will stop here, is research and investment. In the US, there is something called DARPA, which I'm sure you know, which is public money that is awarded to private sector research on a competitive basis to invest into new promising technology. And this, we can also take some inspiration in Europe. That's a typical public-private sort of cooperation. In the US, it had, that's what the origin of internet. And I think this is an example of how they can be successful use of public money for private sector investment and innovation.
Thank you. Noi siamo stati bravissimi, siamo perfetti.
Well, we are perfectly on time to see whether there are questions from the audience. I have a question coming from Professor Termini. A question for Rossi. As a former general director of the bank with such a low interest and with such an expansionary monetary policy, no, I correct myself. So interest rates are so low. Do you think that these facilitate investment, or are they a risk for financial markets? Do you think we will have further speculations? Well, low interest rates are the precondition for every investment. There is no doubt about that. Obviously, when they last for a long period of time, low or even negative interest rates have some criticalities because some sectors of the financial market, for example, insurance companies, may suffer from that as investors. But let's say, in general, interest rates, if low, they favor investments. But the problem is that in the current moment, monetary policy alone, so low interest rate policy, is a precondition, but it's not the engine. it cannot be the engine of an investment or of a growth or a relaunch. So the engine can be the private sector, for example, the willingness to take risks, to open up new businesses, new initiatives. And in terms of the public sector, fiscal policies. So monetary policies, in my opinion, have finished their task. They can keep conditions as they are, but they cannot be the engine of such a development.
And how can we overcome this condition? Well, as I told you, this is a combination of fiscal policies and will and desire to act, to innovate, to enterprise on the part of private entities. At this moment, it seems that something else prevails because there is uncertainty vis-à-vis the future. So people tend not to do that. I do not know how we can break that vicious circle, but for sure it is something that we have to do, and that is valid and that applies to Italy. Italy is not the only economy which is in this trap of a growth which is lower than it could be, than its potential. Italy has been in this condition for some years now. So I would like to ask this question also to Professor Boone. From your privileged observatory of OECD, what do you see? There are many countries. Are there many countries in this trap in the world, which is the trap of having a growth which is lower than it could be?
At the current juncture, yes, there's a high risk that if policy doesn't help to move much more forcefully, we get trapped in this low growth, low rate economy. But let me mention a few things. I think one of the things, and Salvatore mentioned insurance company, for example. Yes, low interest rates mean that when one is investing into sovereign bonds, it doesn't bring much, reward. But it should be an incentive to actually invest into more productive investment like equity and not sovereign bonds. And I think, and this is something that has been going on for a long time, we can actually argue that there should be a change of regulation on insurance policies so that equities are less penalized than what they are today. And that would actually help these big investors to invest into more risky adventure, which are the ones that can bring growth. So look at regulation is one of the things. And I'm not saying by no means what I'm going to say now is easy, but I think the key to unlock the situation when we are today is to provide confidence. And if we cannot provide full confidence on the health situation, actually each of us can do its share to make sure that there's no second wave by, doing the physical distanciation and so on. But economic policy can also help to restore confidence. We've learned a lot from previous crises, and we've learned a lot from the phase one of this crisis. Now we know which tools we have to help firms and to help people. And we can actually policymakers can commit that they will use these tools in a manner that can be adjusted to the economic situation. So, for example, if the Italian government had to confine once again some city or some area, then they can deploy very quickly the job retention scheme and pay people for the period of the confinement. They can protect firms' owner for the period of the confinement. And then when the region or sector reopens, then this policy can be adjusted to actually stop if people can restart working. Or one of the things that Italy can do is actually have some fast-track solvency procedure for firms who cannot make it. because it's very long, the insolvency process in Italy, and also remove any stigma for the entrepreneur whose company has run into trouble because of the COVID. So these are the things, if policy pre-commits, that will give confidence to take risk and to adjust. And perhaps since we have Salvatore here, and I cannot help but talk about digital technology. What we are seeing in this crisis is with digital tools, like not only we can telework, which obviously helps, but also we can measure very precisely, nearly in real time, what people are doing, whether they're consuming, whether they're going out. And because we can see what they're doing, we can adjust policies to support those who are actually harmed by what's going on. Like we can target very precisely people who are losing their job. We can measure quite precisely whether people are consuming or not, and then we can tailor-make some support for people to consume better. So we can also make a lot of progress with policy to make sure that it's evolving in line with the economic situation, which is something that we couldn't do before. And I think that's super important in this phase.
Vuole aggiungere qualcosa?
Would you like to add something? I would only like to add that I absolutely agree with Laurence, and this is an aspect which is not sufficiently debated publicly, I mean, because you see, new digital technologies can also help policies be more timely and targeted. I'm old enough to remember that in the 1970s, which is 50 years ago or so, Italy had a terrible currency crisis. It was January 1976, simply because those in charge of guiding monetary policy at the time was not informed in a timely way about what was happening. There was a temporal lag of 3, 4, 5 months. And currency reserves were being reduced in that moment, and people in charge did not know that. So information came through later on, or by intuition. It seems incredible that this happened, but it happened. So digital technologies provide information in real time, and they provide information about the effect of economic policies. So economic policies can be much more effective. And I agree absolutely with the fact that Laurence decided to underline also this positive aspect of digital technologies. You are right. This is a very interesting topic that should also help us be more effective in fighting against tax evasion. Absolutely. So we are drawing it to a close. I thank you so much. I thank Professor Boone for being with us. Thank you, Professor Rossi. And see you at the next appointment of the festival. Thank you.
Thank you.